Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here today. We have a very distinguished guest with us today here, Professor John Stanfield, who's a research director with rank for democracy, governance and service delivery at the HSRC. He was appointed there in September 2016. And prior to that, he was at the United States, where he worked from 2014 as a distinguished professor of social sciences and public policies and founding director of the McGuy International Development and Governance Research Institute. He was recruited from Indiana University in Bloomington, and he was also a senior historical sociologist of knowledge, focusing on cross-cultural studies of human rights and multicultural restorative justice in Africa and the diaspora. Other fields include the philanthropic studies related to international development and governance issues pertinent to peace and justice issues. Before that, he also worked at Yale University. He was a professorship in Sierra Leone, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, London. He also has had many research grants from people such as the Ford Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and the National Science Foundation in the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. Thank you very much for being with us here today, John.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. It's so good to be here. My sharing with all of you today is derived from also ethnographic and casual ethnography observation notes while living as well as conducting research in and about Brazil, South Africa, Rwanda, and my own homeland, the United States, over the course of a number of years. Can you hear me okay back there? Okay, so I don't have to put on my pre-show voice. All right. As life experiences during these cross-national journeys would have it, I have transformed greatly from merely being concerned about race and racism, and a term I call racialism across societies, to being concerned with getting rid of race altogether through restorative justice processes of transparency which allow perpetrators and victims in the making of racial hegemonies and hierarchies to find their humanity once again through rehumanizing each other and sustain their newly unified lives together, through living authentic, interculturally opening lives as lifelong valued embedded identities. Our conversation today is dedicated to the 1942 publication of the seminal Man's Most Dangerous Myth by my friend, actually an academic grandfather of mine, British anthropologist Ashley Montagu, who was born in 1905 and died in 1999. In 1997, I had the honor to edit and publish the last edition of Ashley's monumental critique of the myth of race. It, more than any other scholarship in the 1940s, injected social constructionism thinking about race in the emerging post-World War II world. My tip is to acknowledge and also, more importantly, build up and go beyond what my gracious grandfatherly friend had to say, such as race as ambiguity, and all the dynamics thereof, and of course the critique I offer of critical race theories, of which he was very much a major thought leader, though seldom cited founder in the 20th century. Those of you who enjoy baking, say the making and baking or chocolate cakes, can relate to the metaphor of what it means to change your mind. And thus, of course, after you have titled a paper for marketing purposes, and then while completing it after title submission, you add a little bit here, and you add a little bit there, to add more flavor. So of course, it is still a chocolate cake, but with a slightly different flavor. This is the nature of my thoughts I wish to share with you today in regards to addressing, as the title indicates, the determined pursuit of humanity's most dangerous myth, race as ambiguity in African slavery legacy societies, e.g. Brazil, South Africa, United States, those societies which were products of the 400-year African slave trade. I now feel the necessity to discuss, more than originally planned, a critique of some basic problems with the emergent 1990s and beyond critical race theories movement, and the need to go beyond it, and to point out as well what should be the goal of the critique of getting rid of the myth of race and its tragic societal uses, namely intercultural openness, meaning going beyond tolerance to move towards becoming an authentically embracing society, embracing the humanity of everyone. I will be addressing both of these issues. And paradoxically, I will discuss race as ambiguity as the most fundamental societal ingredient of what is really needed for true intercultural openness to occur in African slavery legacy societies and in other societies in which the myth of race is made so fundamentally, tragically real, and how human beings identify and treat themselves and others in such grotesquely dehumanizing ways make it be seen so mundane and normal, and how people are born, reared, and develop in the institutions, communities, and systems in which they create, which constitute their race-centered societies. One of the most greatest ironies of the emergent 1990s and beyond critical race theories, even for decades before, is that although the mythology of this most unfortunate way to define and treat human beings is vigorously opposed and defined as dehumanizing social construction reality, it is presumed audiences of such critiques understand what race is as a formal definition. And so such definitions are rarely, if ever, made explicit in critical race discourses. So here is my operational definition of race. In quotation marks, by the way, since it is a myth, thus it does not exist unless we human beings make it matter in how we identify self and others and attitudes, opinion, cognition, perception, words, and behavior. Race is, as Ashley Montagu put it, our most dangerous myth. We human beings make and use, and here we go, make and use, premised on the false perfect association between real or imagined physical features, such as skin color, hair texture, nose and eye shape, and human attributes, such as levels and degrees of intelligence, moral character or lack thereof, personalities, wealth and poverty, language and cultural abilities and tastes. I'll say it again. Race is, as Ashley Montagu put it, our most dangerous myth we human beings make and use, premised on the false perfect association between real or imagined physical features such as skin color, hair texture, nose, and eye shape, and human attributes, that is who we are, such as levels and degrees of intelligence, moral character, or lack thereof, personalities, wealth or poverty, language and cultural attributes, and taste. I look a certain way, and therefore I am a certain way. I look a certain way, and therefore I am a certain way. So it is the way race works. The word should be etched in our minds. When it comes to race is real or imagined physical features, especially the word imagined, since the common use of the word race often has us believing, and this is another shortcoming of the usual terms of critical race theories, is that there is always something physical about races being different. In actual fact, that is the easy way out when it comes to thinking about what race is as something we human beings create and use. Be it physical or imaginary, race making is a product of our multi-generational socialization in specific historical phases of societal development and ecosystem locations within societies. Actually, as grotesque as race-making is, be it based on obvious physical differences or imaginary differences amongst people who actually look very similar physically, like skin color and hair texture, the most horrible examples of the consequences of using race to justify oppression, genocide, war, over those in which differences are imaginary, and so socialization are made to be quite real. The 1915 to 1917 Armenian genocide, the 1930s, 1940s Nazi Germany Jewish Holocaust, and the 1994 Rwanda genocide all come to tragic mind. In the United States, 19th and early 20th century decades were filled with cases of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, calling their physically similar Irish and Eastern European immigrant brothers and sisters inferior races, especially if they happen to be Catholics or Jews. We see a similar race-making history of the so-called white people with similar physical features and from Western Europe calling each other different races in the history of 19th through mid-20th century British colonials in South Africa, viewing the Boers as inferior races. Such views have been well documented in South African popular and more scholarly literature over the decades. For instance, we have the late 19th century observations about Boers by South African English women Arthur Schreiner. If you haven't seen this book as sociologists or budding sociologists, I suggest you take a look at it. Actually, a superb feminist sociologist, as well as a novelist, published in her collection of writings, Thoughts on South Africa, as well as in the recently discovered additional writings of Emily Hobhouse about the British concentration camps for Boer women and children, in which at least 65,000 died in the Second World War. As much as understandable attention is paid to paid in South Africa these days on white privilege and black and other non-white deprivilege, the history of English and Afrikaner race-making, shall we say, among white people, is an equally tragic experience of race-making in need of more comprehensive attention, including the need of authentic restorative justice processes of confessions, apologies, forgiveness, reconciliation, and deserving reparations. Another paper, another lecture, and definitely another book. Let's now move on. There's no time to go into it fully, but race was in the 19th century invented and used in different ways in different efforts to build and sustain African slavery legacy societies, such as the three we are focused on today: Brazil, South Africa, and United States. The common late 18th and 19th centuries thread running through this concern is when human equality and human rights were emerging in the global wind, those the white European descent elites and mass publics who had an interest in rationalizing the continuation of internal, if not international, African slave trading, creating and sustaining lucrative slave-based societies, and the sustainability of their own international imperialistic designs. Be they white elites, a mass public such as the United States, in the majority, or the minority in Brazil and South Africa, the invention of race, hierarchical, and ideologies embedded in white supremacy and non-white inferiority justifies curbing, if not totally excluding, the citizen rights of blacks and other non-whites. It would need be to justify the continued building of societies rooted in slavery and subjugating, if not exterminating, indigenous people. This was especially the case in Brazil, in South Africa, and in the deep South United States, where being greatly outnumbered created and institutionalized intense white fear and violence to maintain domination and to limit, if not eliminate, black and otherwise non-white competition. Another common thread weaved through the historical examination of African slavery-related societies and other race-centered societies such as Northern Ireland or modern Australia is not only the invention and uses of race as a dehumanizing mythology, but also is the opposition to such dehumanized mythologies and their tragic uses of what we have formerly come to call critical race theories emerging in the 1990s and beyond. This is to say, and as I tried to provide illustrations of in a longer draft of this presentation, there is a long legacy of critical race theorists dating back to the colonial and early nation-building periods of African slavery-related societies and of other societies, race societies, in need of more closer examination. This is especially the case of those writers who wrote cross-nationally about the dangers of race as mythology, tragically made so real in human affairs. There are two major problems of these pioneers which overflow in the emerging 1990s and beyond critical race theory schools of thought in the three African slavery-related societies such as Pan-African thought, African diaspora thought, race and gender thought, race and class thought, race and colonialism, post-colonialism thought, race and law thought, and histories of race, humanities, and social sciences disciplines and general societies. First, pioneering and contemporary race theorists have tended to be ahistorical and not addressing the deep contextual histories of the idea of race, meaning the external, societal, and more specific localized environmental conditions which shape the development of people, intellectuals, ordinary societal residents who create, use, and critique such myths and their uses, ranging from everyday life, common sense, to formulating and implementing policies and governance in civil society. I'm thinking about, as examples from the histories of race literature, two seminal texts in the 1990s and beyond era. Stephen Gould's The Mismeasure of Man, and my homeboy, Cornel West, Race Matters, both of which suffer from barely ever acknowledging the long legacies of their critiques, which were actually made much more eloquently, such as Thomas Gossett's Race, and more importantly, Ashley Montagu's Man's Most Dangerous Men, but also, ironically, both drawing the more illustrious intellectual ancestors and being non-contextual. There's a second deeper problem than the serious one just mentioned regarding the lack of proper acknowledgement in the absence of deep contextual historical analysis. It has to do with the tendency for both pioneering and contemporary critical race theorists to essentialize race, reifying it from historical groundings and encouraging homogeneous, or that is, overly simplistic, socially constructed categories of people in various societal and cultural contexts. So we have descriptions and critiques of white privilege and of black privilege. In this sense, critical race theorists are strange bedfellows, believe it or not, with a very traditional white supremacy thinking about homogeneous categorical races, though of course with polar extreme interpretations of the categorical boxes. It is this essentialization of race which grounds race categorization and how we describe and critique in the social sciences and humanities focus on such matters, and of course embeds the construction of census and vital statistical tables to report on who people supposedly are, at least in terms of governmental and civil society definitions. It is ironic that critical race theorists essentialize race, since they define themselves as being social constructionists. If they were truly social constructionists in the phenomenology perspective of Alfred Schwartz, they would realize that dividing people up and these stereotypical mosaics of rainbow boxes is buying into stereotypes of people being homogeneous. And speaking of human experiences, what Ashley Montagu observed over 70 years ago, which most critical race theorists and those who are not too critical at all seem to miss, is that race is not merely a category involving the false perfect correlation between real or imagined physical attributes and who people are. Race, as well, is how and what people experience. Race, as well, is how and what people experience in their daily lives while developing self-defined identities and being subjected to, conforming to, or resisting identities imposed by societies and institutions and communities within them. To take this Montagu observation steps further, if we step back and look at how we essentialize race as categorization, and how we view ourselves and others in societies where race is a myth, which is made to count in our emotional, social, economic, and political lives, it is more than apparent how race as identity, as well as lived experiences, is rooted and grounded in ambiguity. Rather than being neat and clear categorical boxes we can draw direct interpretations from. That is the very fact that we human beings make race wherever we wish means the experience of race varies. It can and does vary from society to society and from region to region, community to community, and institution to institution within societies. We all know this from the commonsensical stock of knowledge of the societies which rear us, if we are aware, which unfortunately is rare, which is why racial ideologies are so readily and daily produced and reproduced. In South Africa, being an Afrikaner, being English, being a white ethnic, being Asian, being Jewish, or Zulu, or Xhosa, or colored, or Indian person, does not necessarily mean the same thing in each region of the nation state. Same thing when it comes to being white ethnics, black, mulatto, Latino, Asian, Jewish in the American Northeast, Deep South, Midwest, or Far West, or being black, brown skinned, or white ethnics in Sao Paulo, Manaus, Rio, Salvador, let alone in villages and towns. This is because we are not talking about chemistry and physics, my friends, but about human beings who vary in how they come to define themselves and others in communities and institutions, depending upon their various needs and interests. It is important to understand the regional and community variance of race within and across societies, which make it ambiguous for a number of reasons. First, unless we have traveled to and more ideally lived in various parts of our societies, such as Brazil, South Africa, the United States, it is difficult to imagine this observation to be true. It is secondly because African slavery-linked societies, through the mass media and public cultures, as well as school curriculum, standardize and objectify categorical racial labels like white, black, indigenous, draining them of their experiential complexities and paradoxes. Third, the way we reproduce barriers to intercultural openness and lifelong values and experiences is through embracing simplistic stereotypes of the racialized other, which would be hard to do if we grew up in a society in which complexity of human experiences within and across racialized boxes was stressed in how we are raised and how we grow up. Race as identity is ambiguous as well for a number of reasons. First, just as a routine daily practice in societies in which the myth of race is made to be relevant in how we are identified and how we are treated, there are great gap variations amongst individuals between their self-definitions, how they're defined in their communities, and in institutions in which they work, consume, play, and worship, and then how governments officially define them. Am I going too fast? No, just yell at me if I am. There are people in Brazil, the States, and South Africa who are dark brown skinned, though in values and even through their multi-generation socialization, view themselves as being white, are viewed in their communities as being colored or mulatto, in the workplace as being black, in an official government definition are viewed as being colored or black, or just other. And certainly there are, at times, conscious manipulation of these identity terminologies by individuals who understand clearly the game of race in their societies. It reminds me of a high professional friend of mine here in South Africa with a professional work history story which is commonly heard in this society. She is of East Indian and colored background and actually identifies personally as being East Indian, the heritage of her mother who resides in Johannesburg. When we first met nearly 20 years ago, she lived in Cape Town, stretching her colored identity and getting professional positions, helped by being married to a colored man. When she divorced and moved to Johannesburg in the same type of profession, she of course realized that being up north, where being East Indian was much more preferred than being colored, she switched to her East Indian identity in her job pursuits. We can go from society to society and see how common it is for people to have multiple identities when it comes to racialization, which they consciously manipulate to effectively navigate institutions, communities, and systems. The problem is, of course, comes into play when it comes to language switching, which if you are not appropriately bilingual or multilingual, the lack of language proficiency can circumvent the ability to raise a cultural switch. It really becomes tricky when people look the same in terms of skin color and other physical features, but are foreigners who can't navigate effectively since they cannot switch with ease since they are not from here, as the accents convey. Even when they can switch linguistically, unless they can do so without a noticeable accent. It is like what I experienced here in South Africa, where I can hide being an American and pass as colored or black African, even as an East Indian or as a foreign black man from a neighboring or further away African country, until I open my big mouth and have to show my passport. I can't wait till the Zulu or Kosher or Afrikaans or all the above and see what happens. Especially if I can learn to speak without an accent. In the United States, my homeland, I'm called all kinds of things, believe it or not, and at times asked what I am. In fact, I may ask you later on. Some assume I'm indeed a black man, which is only partially right. Others, because of my brown skin color, assume I am a black and white mulatto heritage, which is completely wrong. And others even assume that I'm East Indian American or foreigner. I was paying for a new pair of shoes once in Boston some years ago with a Chinese woman friend of mine while chatting with the East Indian cashier, pointing to my friend. The cashier asked, does she understand the language? What language? I asked. Oh, so said the cashier, you're not from India? In Brazil, as the Americans say, is something else. No matter what brown or darker you are or how white you look, you can self-choose, so to speak, what you want to be and declare it as your official category. I remember sitting with an Afro-Brazilian embassy official once near the entrance way where we could watch people returning from their lunch break. We were talking about this self-choice tradition. So to illustrate, every time a dark-skinned employee came through the door, she told me whether the person viewed themselves as being white or black. The problem is that no matter if a black or brown-skinned Brazilian self-defines as being white, larger society, especially if you have black skin, still views you as being inferior. And that's worthy of jokes, like calling your teacher Black Monkey. Black Monkey as a student, so as an Afro-Brazilian teacher told me once about the common practice for students addressing her. Or discrimination such as in employment, residence, and having to use a back door. This sort of problem of being brown or especially dark skinned with white identity or not is actually situational depending upon how well someone understands your status and if I would give you a break, contributing to the notion of friendly racism. You are discriminated against only if people don't know your status. It is the reason why a Brazilian sociologist residing in the States told me once that whenever African Americans visit him in his homeland, he tells them to speak loudly with their American accents so locals will treat them with respect. Another story, this time in Brazil, very quickly. A few years ago, I was being driven home through an all-white, affluent community in Rio by a very talkative, prominent, black-skinned Brazilian academic after a cozy lunch at a white Brazilian philanthropist residence. He was talking so much and so fast, he wasn't looking where he was driving and ran a stop sign into the side of a car being driven by a white-appearing woman. If it was in America, two black men driving through an affluent white neighborhood and side-ramming a car, clearly in the wrong. The cops would have come, ticketed, if not arrested the driver, and it would have been bad news in traffic court. And if the cop had been racist, she would have made it clear, with or without saying directly, that you had no business being in a white neighborhood. Probably still here. So I experienced in white suburbs. So as upsetting as the incident was to both of us, I put on my ethnographic lenses and decided to pay attention to what would happen next. Well, the driver of the hit car, visibly shaken and angry, came out of the car, as did my colleague leave the car and approach her. A few so-called white neighbors came out. Yeah, I thought in my African-American paranoia, a mob is gathering. Both drivers decided to move the vehicles to the side of the street, while one of the neighbors called the police. While we were waiting for the cops to come, one of the taller white-appearing Brazilians, nosy neighbors, engaged my colleague outside the car in a conversation. I decided to leave my passenger's side seat and go out to support my colleague with my poor Portuguese speaking skills the best I could. When I got out and approached the guys, I could understand enough Brazilian Portuguese to hear my colleague say to the neighbor, he does not speak Portuguese. He's American. This thing I see and hear is a neighbor smiling, saying in accent English, hello! I spent some time in New York City and Harlem. And so they're shacking as the police arrive. I really expected them to haul us both away to jail. Instead, as I returned to the car, my colleague had a brief conversation with the police, comes back to the car to get his car registration, plus I now suspect his university ID. He has a brief conversation with the police, comes back to the car, and we drive away with no ticket or reprimand from the police. Shocked, I asked my colleague, what happened? Nothing, he said in his broken English. The other driver is upset, but no problem. Certainly an example of friendly racism, I'm sure, when the police found out him to be a distinguished Afro-Brazilian professor, though with jet black skin. I don't have time to discuss the following either, unfortunately, but it is important to understand as well, especially in the Brazilian case, but also in all African slavery societies and in other racist societies, what happened to people who, though defined as white, and look so-called white, who's helped to find as some racialized other, due to ancestry or even due to ethnic affinity, such as the arts, politics, social residency, and intimate relationships, and outcomes such as biracial children who view themselves as being black. I have two blonde-haired, blue-eyed Brazilian women colleagues who view themselves as being black women. One for the reason of having black ancestry, and the other due to, as she puts it, being born into a European Brazilian family, but with a black soul. Though to further press in some details for the matters of race as ambiguity, there are two kinds of African ancestral blacks who look white passing. Unintentional and intentional, very simple. Unintentional passing is when a white-looking person has no idea about black ancestry, since over time it has been amputated from family history. As a family history, as a family secret, if not scanned or hidden and over time just forgotten about. It can become a mystery then when in time a black or brown skinned child is birthed seemingly out of nowhere. It is also interesting when, as in the recorded case of white-looking African-American Greg Williams' autobiography, Life Along the Color Line, when a parent announces to a child he or she is really passing for white, and what happens to the child when he or she is taken to live with black relatives. Such discovery of black ancestry by white-looking African-Americans who grew up in a white community is a growing popular literature trend in the States in the past 15 or so years. It will be interesting to see how such a literary canon begins to noticeably sprout in Brazil and in South Africa for comparative cross-national analyses. Intentional passing from being of black African descent to being of white European descent. How and why it is done is a growing field in popular confessional literature in all three societies, in other societies in which the mythology of race is made to have real consequences. It has the deepest roots in the United States, dating back to the 1890s and early 20th century novels of Charles Chestnut, James Weldon Johnson, Jean Toomer, and Nellie Larson. The intentional passing black, or in South Africa context, color, as well as is seen as either one who totally disappears into white life, never to be heard from again from black relatives, or who keep their distance from black relatives who know who they are, or who remains in touch with black or colored communities, including those who serve as white community intelligence bridges for black and otherwise non-white political and civic leaders. The sociological novels and autobiographies of African American writers, writing from the 1910s through the 1940 time period, are filled with hints of knowing passing blacks and their intelligence gathering benefits to black communities. It certainly still goes on in all African slave-related societies, in having passing blacks serving as intelligence information bridges from the seemingly all-white settings to black communities and networks. While social scientists in and about race-centered societies may have, relatively speaking, depending upon the society, have published over the decades about miscegenation, mixed race populations such as mestizos, mulattoes, and colors, there is yet to be very much said with empirical evidence about how intentional pastors live their lives, how they do such things as manipulate white status, such as when they use it intentionally, when they don't. Such situational passing for the purpose of employment, getting hotel accommodations, etc., while returning to black communities each night or during school holiday, is a tradition in these societies which have yet to be studied as much as they should be. There's other variations with this, but let me jump to my conclusion so we can have some conversation here. The last issue of race and ambiguity is a matter of who we really are, namely the mosaic of our ancestries. That is, the complete histories of our family origins in which we are born and reared, even if we do not know the complete mosaic. Even though our race is a myth that we are taught and taken for granted or intentional ways exist with consequences in how we think about self and others and how we treat others, our mosaic of ancestries is real. Race is false. Mythology, ancestry is real. And too often, we don't know the whole story about who we really are in these kind of societies. Because of the fact that too often, as being migrant societies, people come from places in which they had tabooed ancestry. And so when they move to other places, they can have the tendency to reinvent who they are to the point of basically Xing out certain branches. And I wrote an earlier paper about this situation, about South Africa and Brazil, United States. You know, all these folks who migrate to these countries, basically forgetting the fact that they have Jewish background, or they have African background. Sometimes not even knowing. The reason why you would not see me calling Barack Obama as our first black president, and instead I would say he's the first apparent black president, is that we've had a number of cases like Dwight Eisenhower, for instance, who was a white black person. His mommy was black. If you look at his photos, you'll notice that usually only the photos of him middle age and beyond tend to be publicized. Only very recently do you see pictures of him as an infant, as a child. At West Point, you can see the so-called Negro features. I don't know whether he was whitening or what, but he came from an immigrant European background. He happened to come from an area of Germany, his ancestors did, that had a large mulatto population in Germany. Which is also a reason why, folks, we need to start revising how we do immigrant history. And instead of basically dealing with immigrant history from the standpoint of what we sociologists call ecological fallacy, thinking that Europe means all white, Africa means all black. We need to provincialize that a great deal. So where does all this take us? It takes us to the argument, as difficult as it may seem to be. We need to start considering how do we start reconfiguring how it is that we define ourselves. how it is that we define ourselves, others, and more than that, how do we go about working with governments and civil society to start restructuring, as difficult as it may seem, to move from race, to move towards notions of mosaics of ancestry. And of course, this is a very, very difficult thing to do, because race not only matters, but race is profitable. People profit from race thinking. Rather than talk about politics, you talk about issues of distributing who gets what and what. Okay, and so what I'm talking about is not easy, but it's a necessity if we're going to begin to develop more authentic ways of identifying who we are, not only objectively, but through our school systems, how we structure our curriculum, how basically we deal with the media in terms of ceasing dealing with race, et cetera, et cetera. Now, again, very, very difficult, but the more we think in this way, the more we explore the myth of race, what happens is that we begin to unpackage and deal with the whole issue of how complex we are. Another thing it does, my friends, is it reconnects all of us in understanding that we're brothers and sisters, we're all human beings. And we may be more brothers and sisters than what we think. There's a recent book about the fact that at least 8% of the African population in this country are black and otherwise non-white in terms of heritage. Similar statistics about other so-called white populations in the United States and Brazil. We're all mixed up. There's no such thing as pure anything. What matters is that when we decouple ourselves from race and start looking at each other in a more connected way, that we may find ourselves moving towards a much more interculturally opening society. Okay, so let me end there. But the issue is that there's a myth, it's a dangerous myth, and therefore it's ambiguous because we all live our lives in ways that have nothing to do with a box. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. That was very insightful.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Okay, we have another 40 minutes. We can open up the floor for questions and answers.
You give me time to get some water.
Of course.
So please. Was I clear? Yeah. Okay. Did anybody fall asleep? No, I'm kidding. Okay. So please, questions, insights, criticisms. It's a university.
Well, I guess I'll start. I'm also American.
Where are you from?
I've been teaching here for 2 weeks and 2 days. Originally, I'm from Connecticut.
Oh, Connecticut. Where in Connecticut?
In Storrs, where the university is.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah. So my impression of South African society is very new, if you like. And in some ways, I had lived in Chicago before this for 10 years, and in some ways, kind of patterns of racial architecture of cities and urban kind of segregation seems very familiar to me, but some things that are kind of security culture seem specific to South Africa. But I guess my question for you is there's just a very large gap politically and institutionally between kind of being able to embrace a kind of common heritage of humanity in which we are all mixed up together and looking at the existing patterns of kind of racial organization and architecture that we are actually living in Stellenbosch and I think in other places in South Africa that I have not been in many of them. And so I guess my question is, how does one kind of bridge the gap between the, and I think that there are species of, I'm not an expert in critical race theory, but I think that there is a species of academics who agree in the abstract, absolutely, race is a social construct. But somehow I think that your talk would provoke anxiety among them because they would feel that it being a social construct means that it's inescapable in a certain way. Maybe this is what it is to be a social construct, is to structure our lives in ways that we are not readily able to step outside of. And so in that sense, I can imagine a kind of resistance, and I think that this can lead into ultimately a certain kind of essentialism that is unacknowledged, which I think is part of your point. But I think that there is an argument that I would imagine someone making, maybe someone here will make it, I don't know, which would say, look, race is a social construct, but it is a materialized social construct around us, and so to criticize it kind of theoretically doesn't really take us out of it kind of in terms of our politics, in terms of our institutional situations. And so I guess my question for you is kind of how does one bridge the gap between criticizing race as a kind of theoretically as a social construct and encountering it politically as as this thing that structures, the very names of buildings on many universities.
Yes, and which name?
Eli.
Eli, pleasure.
Yeah,
I appreciate that very much. There was an area of my paper I did not say because I wanted us to have time for conversation. By the way, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate that. And I wanted to come because this seminar's topic is transformation. And I don't know, maybe I'm just an idealistic older man, but I've been around academia long enough to know what university can do when you want to do it. And so when it's a Stellenbosch University, a seminar on transformation, do I want to pass it up? Are you kidding? No. No, because I think any major South African university that takes transformation seriously understands just how much power academics can have. Especially at major silos of Ivy Towers like Stellenbosch, UCT, WITS, and University of Pretoria. And those of you who are young enough to be my grandchildren, wait until you're old enough, and you just stick with us in academia, and you'll see what academics can do when they want to organize through their networks, not only on campus, but the networks in the highest places in government, civil society. Don't think that we are just a lot of abstract people who have no influence at all. We do. And so I think that the starting point should be to have more conversations like this in universities, and for faculty, for administrators to utilize the networks in government, in civil society, to start really a movement of all people, and this is my pastoral, of all people, we academics should know better than be perpetuating mythologies. We should be, in our curriculum, in our classes, in our research, we should be debunking this stuff, but also, having solutions, having alternatives, such as the one I tossed out, which is up for debate. But this is where it should start. Why not? I've seen academics, not only in my country, but in Brazil, Great Britain, and even here, do tremendous things when they have a mind to do it, in terms of linking up with the society and developing study groups of various kinds that you bring people in to hear this stuff. People who can make a difference in terms of policy, media, and whatnot. And so I think that's where we start, and also we start doing the same thing in terms of grassroots communities as well, in regards to working with major points of influence in grassroots communities, rather the pastors of churches and mosques, rather they are influence of families, rich or poor, media, the power of media. I am
you might be interested in knowing this. At HSRC, I'm developing an area called intercultural South Africans, in which we're pulling together representatives from grassroots communities of various kinds, rich and poor, cross-racially, Afrikaner, English, Zulu, Xhosa. And we're putting together a model that we hope will be replicated in other cities, just dealing with various levels, not only various levels of communication, but also making people who are involved in these processes to link up back to where they work, where they live, to bring about more grassrooted, not only conversations, but conversations which go someplace in regards to environmental policy. Again, as I said, this is not talking about chemistry or physics. We're human beings, and with the ways, with the will, there are ways. We have a lot of problems in the States, God do it right now. But even still, though, the amount of change that occurred in the States between the 1950s and the present has been phenomenal. Phenomenal. And and when you look at it, it's a history of people. Academic institutions and professional circles like medicine and law, figuring out ways to work together. That's the reason why we have Barack Obama emerge. Barack Obama did not emerge out of a Cracker Jack box. There are certain sociological and political conditions which facilitated his rise. Okay? All right, are there any other questions? Yes. And what's your name?
My name's Yasmina. I'm a student.
Yasmina, okay.
Thanks for the presentation. I liked what you were saying about kind of the model, taking into account experiences in different locations and not kind of creating thinking of race as this kind of homogenous thing. But I wanted to ask about, and I also like the way you linked it to kind of migration. I think that's very interesting, but I wanted to ask about this notion of ancestry, and I mean, if race is socially constructed, certainly, ancestry would be as well. I mean, I wanted to ask you more about that kind of
Well, the thing is that I have no control over who births me, who my ancestors are. So it's not totally a social construction. It's what I know about myself, partially or totally. That's why I call this mosaics of ancestries. Because even if I don't know about certain branches, and these certain branches come from different cultures, intergenerationally, those values and those experiences are going to have an impact on me, even though I don't have any idea where they come from. Like post-traumatic stress, we're finding out, coming from slavery, coming from genocide, so forth and so on, values passing down. You might even know about it. I'm just finding out that my maternal grandfather, who for years was a shadowy figure in my family history, who supposedly was gassed in World War I, and this caused a host of emotional problems. Find out that the man was involved in a 1918 slaughter of 1,000 black people in Arkansas, and that he was tortured and whatnot. My mother right now speaks with a stutter. Where did that come from? Okay, and so again, I'm just finding this out. I didn't know anything about the ancestors at all, but it sure has affected my entire family, and this whole idea of multi-generational post-traumatic stress is an emerging field now in mental health fields in the United States, and it's beginning to come here in terms of looking at the impacts of apartheid, pre-apartheid, for instance. And what's tragic there is where you don't even know your African background, so to speak, a black African background, or you don't understand that you're African and that your post-traumatic stress problems, come from what happened in the camps. That's, unresolved. Okay, so I want to stress, some of it is social construction, but some of it is who I am, whether I know it or not. Yes.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. But when you were talking about Barack Obama not being the first black or African American president to you, I think what came to my mind at that point was this issue of choice when it comes to identification. How do you want to be addressed? How do you want to identify? Now, if Barack Obama feels that he's black, right? But to you, you don't believe he's black enough to be black. So there's this idea of called interpretation, how identities are hailed into existence. Now, from your point of view, he's not black.
I'm sorry, sir, but I didn't say that.
But yeah, you said he's not. Okay, how did you put it now?
There was a previous president who.
The previous presidents that had African descent ancestry.
Yeah, then
Right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay, then
What's your name? By the way?
Stephen, but how can we talk? Because there's this movement now of people coming out, some white people coming out to say that they're actually blacks. Do you understand?
Mm-hmm.
And you have a band of black people saying, no, you are not black. So how, I don't know if you could say something about this. How do you see this? Are we just allowed to choose how we want to identify? Can I just wake up one day and say, I'm no longer black?
Well, they do it in Brazil all the time. Actually. But the question is well taken. And you see, this is where it means, where's your proof? Where's the ancestral proof of what you are? And actually, the Brazilian government is very big in this now because of affirmative action. Okay, and what you're talking about here is affirmative action and the kind of goodies you get. In the United States, it's the same thing. Our people kind of say, well, I'm black, I'm biracial, the black side. And with Barack Obama, by the way, calling himself black was a political move. I mean, he's actually multiracial. Barack Obama is actually Asian. He's Indonesian Hawaiian. Culturally, with an African father, of course, but it's an Indonesian Hawaiian background that he'll socialize into. Another long story, we can have tea later on. But the thing is that sure, there's the actual mosaic of ancestry that have to be reconstructed and documented. But also, you're right, there's this politics of identity. That also has to be taken into account. But in terms of my comment about previous black presidents, that's based upon ancestral work that's been done. Okay, and keep in mind that, and I know you're not saying this, but as a footnote, you see, my ancestry, even my so-called race identity, has nothing to do with my politics. Okay, which is another first cousin of all this. Where people were sorely mistaken when they thought that because Barack Obama, politically speaking, identified as being black, that he was going to be for black civil rights, and which is part of the insidious racism of the states, right? If you're black, skinned, you're going to have certain values, which is racist. You don't really know that to be the case. But thanks for that, though. Very important. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for a really powerful presentation. And I'm Youngjun, doing my PhD at Munich,
Nice meeting.
at Germany. And in particular, I admire your discussion on multi-layered identification process by place. In some place, you became red. In some place, you became black. In some place, color. It reminds me my experience in South Africa. I did my master's 3 years ago here. In some place, I became Chinese Kung Fu guy. In some place, I became color. In some place, I became black in terms of some field movement here, or something like that. But I believe identification process is reciprocal, mutual. I mean, you only talk about how society objectified you, the self. But it needs much more account for the self. How did you objectify yourself?
Mm-hmm.
So I think, yeah, it needs
Mhm.
more some explanations.
Oh, yes. Yes, and certainly, you know, it has to do with, I hate to put it so crassly, but it has to do with how well people understand the game of race. You know, not only in their own society, but when they go someplace else. Okay? And so, the whole issue of how do people objectify themselves is a very, very paradoxical issue, very complex. And it's just that it's the complexity that we don't study enough, you know, which we need to study, you know, especially if we're going to do the kind of sophisticated analysis that needs to be done on how these kind of societies are held together. You know, totally different than societies where race does not matter, but other things matter, right? And so the other things become multi-layered, for instance, and objectified. We're just very complicated as human beings. And I think that since I'm a sociologist, I can be licensed to say this, that I think that we need a lot of work to do to revise and to make more sophisticated our concepts of identity. Instead of running away from race, watering it down, or watering down ancestry, giving ancestry to anthropologists. And anthropologists study this, not sociologists. We need to really figure out how to refashion ourselves. And by the way, you know, one of the things I always pitch about when I'm talking to a South African audience is that when you look at the history of South Africa, what fascinates me is how experimental South Africans are in all kinds of ways. You know, apartheid was an experiment. You know, post 1994, is very much of an experiment. When I go out and I talk to government officials about each of the development, for instance, as I'm doing right now, I'm just fascinated about these conversations they have about, well, yeah, we tried this, we went to India, we went to China, brought this back to put it on the sides. A very, very experimental place. And so I think that even in the social sciences, there needs to be that kind of challenge about rethinking how we look at society and institutions, issues of identity, in ways that can be very needed, you know, for the world of sociology. Because anybody ever heard of a book called Coming Crisis of Western Sociology by Ellen Gardner? Well, the crisis is here. It's been here for a very long time because there's so much that we can't explain or we don't explain well. And so with the exhaustion of Western notions, Western ideas, even in the social sciences, there's now a lot of room on the global stage to be innovative and to be more relevant. And so the world is waiting for Africans to really play that role like Asians. And so the whole notion of changing how we talk about people, I mean, it's an experiment, you know, that I can see this country taking leadership in some very interesting ways. Yes, and what's your name?
Rob.
Rob, okay.
Thank you very much for your really interesting talk. I think I want to pick up on something that Eli raised at the beginning, and particularly around implications critiquing race thinking, if you like, for transformation. And I can understand that and I'm very sympathetic, I think, with the position you're taking, that race thinking to some extent creates barriers and produces impossibilities of interaction, and that if we're going to develop a more transformed society, then it's important that we develop different categories and ways which cross race boundaries and things like this. And so I think that's important. But at the same time, I also think there's limitations. Actually, if we simply reduce the critique of the contemporary society we're living in to concern about race thinking, because I think there's a danger of wishing away the kind of material foundations. But look, I mean, I think it's hardly surprising that in a place like Stellenbosch, which is so highly segregated in terms of races, and where certain areas become constructed as black areas and coloured areas, and 20 odd years post-apartheid, because that's the reality actually. And it would seem odd if people didn't think racially. I mean, I think racially, and I mean, I think that it's important to deconstruct the idea that race is a biological basis, but can't we hold on to the idea that race is a material basis? I mean, it's almost like if we don't do that, then it feels like it's pulling the rug from the feet of a kind of critique. That we can't begin to critique the way that race operates and works unless to some extent we have a kind of idea about race. I mean, it's like Donald Trump, sort of saying that racism, doesn't really exist. Actually, the problem is in the minds of those people who imagine it exists, and that the perpetrators of racism are just as bad as those people who are trying to defend themselves from racism because they're thinking racially. So isn't there a danger of sort of wishing away the materiality of race and the way in which race operates, as a kind of power structure, by simply saying that the race categories are the products of race thinking? That's false thinking.
Well, thank you very much. The thing is that we're talking about some very heavy-duty stuff having to do with taking into account the way the historical roots of this nation state and nation states like it, whether it's the States or Brazil, which basically is a way of thinking that legitimated power and privilege and the like. And we have to think about what does it really mean to be a 21st century person, I feel, in which we are slowly but surely beginning to understand much more about not only about race, but about gender and about class, about caste, and how these ways of thinking tend to maintain a certain kind of dehumanizing societal order. The question for me, goes back to what do we do as people, in this case as academics, to really begin to unpackage just what it is about this society, and how do we develop processes in which we recover our humanity. It's something that historically speaking, I'm sorry. Yeah, I told you this is the reason why I want to hold on to the podium, because I'm a wanderer. I think get tired of me wandering around. My mother used to get my mother's nerves, because whenever I would have a great idea, I would jump up and walk around. And whenever I'm home now, I still get on her nerves. What are you walking for? You know, we finish a chapter in the book. Wow, what an idea! And I walk around. But the thing is that one of the greatest tragedies of universities and multi-racialized societies is they've been very timid. They've been very passive when it comes to, I think, doing the right thing in regards to being thought leaders to unpackage things. Because irrespective of what we call race, it doesn't exist. You know, and so of all places, why can't we do more as academics to lead the way? I mean, the reason being is we're products of our own socialization too, and in many cases we really don't see these things. And so I have a part of my paper that I also axed out at the very beginning, where I talked about the problems of liberalism in societies like this, where people are progressive in terms of liberalism until, say for instance, blacks, non-blacks begin to rise up and want to be empowered, and then there's a problem, okay, with that. And unfortunately, that's a major problem in universities. Unfortunately, you know, people are progressive, but they don't want to really go all the way and unpackage what, you know. It's like a colleague of mine who's by the name of Eduardo Fisco, who is a recent president of the American Sociological Association, who's made his career as a critical race theorist. And in the introduction of a book that he published, in which I have a chapter in, he was at the University of Michigan at the time. And Michigan is one of the most so-called liberal, progressive universities you can think of, in the sociology department. And he gave a critique about racism. And one of the first things that happens is that one of his colleagues said, "Oh, you're calling us a racist." And he had to defend himself. "Oh, no, you're not racist. I'm not." No, I haven't. No. We're all racialists. Not racist, but racialists. I mean, we grew up in societies like this, meaning to say that our language tends to be tainted with race. We say black women, white women. There's no such thing as white and black women. There are women, like there are men, okay? But when we use adjectives like white and black, we reproduce the nonsense. This whole symbolic business about certain areas being dangerous because of black. You can't go through townships. Dangerous. White areas are completely safe. Well, I can tell you one thing. I've been living in white suburbia. I can tell you some stories. Okay. But when we're talking about how do we transform, it's very hard work, folks, because it has to do with changing ourselves. Dealing with things about ourselves, not because we're bad people, whatever, but because of the way in which we've been socialized. And so that's why, by the way, I believe in restorative justice. You know, people come to the table and just talking about who they are, what they are. Not because, again, we're trying to cast blame, but it's because of the way we've been socialized. To believe that certain things are truthful and certain things are not truthful, which isn't the case. The major case is that we're all human beings. And the question is, how is it that we came to the point of forgetting about that? And how did forgetting about that become the way in which we build institutions and reproduce them? You know, why is that? You know, and so this is the reason why, by the way, in a sort of justice perspective, it's not he did it or she did it, it's that we did it. You know, how do we basically undo what we did? we forget that oppression is relational. You know, it's not just one population doing something to another, but it's relational. And oppressed people have a hard time with that. But oppression is relational. And so how do we reproduce these hierarchies? And how do we all take responsibility, to undo them? Is the issue. But anyway, so my paper, as soon as I clean up my typos, is available, will be available, handwrite, and to hang up someplace in your website, if you like. And let me know if you have any more comments or questions. Anybody interested in this area of research, let me know. I'm always looking for travel companions. And so thank you very much.
Thank you.